Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Sarah and today I'm back to give you some autumn reading recommendations. I posted a video last week where I was talking about some of my reading plans for autumn, and I split it up into 5-6 sort of categories of the type of books that I think are good for autumn. So I thought I would come back and give you some recommendations of books that I've loved in each of those categories if you're looking for some autumn inspiration. So the first category I had was sort of spooky, eerie, unsettling books. I don't read very much of this, I must admit, just because I don't like horror. I don't really read very much genre fiction, so I basically read no horror or no thrillers like at all. And I am scared very easily by things. So I thought I would give some recommendations, not of things that are scary, but just of things that sort of have that like eerie, unsettling feeling to them. So the first is a book that I read quite recently, and that's Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. This is a Mexican, very short sort of novella written in the 80s. And it follows a man whose mother has just died, and on her deathbed she tells him that she wants him to go back to this town to find his father, who is called Pedro Paramo. And so he goes back to this town, and it seems very quiet. There's not much going on, and he starts meeting people, and he discovers very quickly that a lot of the people that he's meeting are not alive still. So this is definitely like, it's not a horror book, it's not scary, but it's a very melancholic, eerie book where he is basically in this ghost town. And we sort of follow the history of all of the characters that have lived there, and we meet his dad as a character, Pedro Paramo, and we follow his backstory as well. I really enjoyed this. This creates such a good atmosphere. Like, I've never read a book that's so atmospheric. I really felt like I was walking through like a Mexican ghost town, and I really love the cover of this edition that I got. It's got like little skeleton people in all of the windows of the house. So yeah, I'd highly recommend this one, and it's a really short read. Another Mexican book that I think creates a really creepy atmosphere is Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. This is a very popular book when it came out a few years ago, but yeah, I really enjoyed this one. More so than Paradise. I didn't like Paradise as much, but Hurricane Season, we basically are in this small Mexican town, and there is a woman who they call the witch, and she has been found murdered, and we go back and we sort of figure out what happened to her. Not in like a murder mystery type way, really. It's more about the sort of misogyny and just the violence in this town and how it's caused. There are things in this book that are really disturbing. So like, yeah, trigger warnings for a lot of things. But the way that Fernanda Melchor writes creates such a creepy atmosphere. This is a book that basically has no paragraph breaks, and we get these really long sentences of description, and it just builds up into this really creepy atmosphere where, yeah, the people in this town are doing really horrible things. They have really horrible views on things, but it's like you're really sucked into their world, and it's kind of disgusting. You want to get away from it, but at the same time you're fascinated. So I would definitely really recommend this one for autumn. I think it's a great autumn read. Yeah, and then a few that I don't actually own, I would really recommend The Melancholy of Resitsance by Lazslo Kraznahorkai. This is a very eerie book, and I found it quite difficult to get through because it's another one where it's quite a short book, but the sentences are incredibly long. In fact, I think each chapter is just like one sentence, and the chapters are like 10-20 pages, so it can be quite difficult to get through. But this is set in a small town in Hungary, and it almost looks like a travelling circus type thing has arrived in the town, and people are like, oh, what's going on? And it turns out it's this very large whale that you can go and visit, and it's like the dead of winter. It is freezing, and everyone's very unsettled by the coming of this whale. They're all like, what does this mean? They're really overthinking it, actually. And we follow different characters as they, like, throughout their day, and we sort of find out their worries, and it builds up into this climax that's very unsettling. I think that like Lazlo Kraznahorkai is a very famous Hungarian writer, and I would like to read more of his stuff because this was just so unusual. Like, again, the writing style was very interesting. The sort of concept of a large whale being displayed in a town is very odd to me, but I really enjoyed it. So yeah, this one is also like a set set in like winter. It's a freezing cold day, so and you sort of get that sort of winter gloom about everything. So I'd really recommend this one. The next one is a book that I talked about in my best books of 2023, and that's The Silent Cry by Kenzaburo. This book is really creepy. This is definitely the most like horror-y book from this list. At the very start of the book, our main character finds out that his friend has committed suicide in like a very unusual way, and at the same time he has a newborn baby that's sort of showing developmental delays essentially, and he is really disgusted by his baby as well. So it's like a very eerie start to the book. He then goes back to his hometown with his wife, and starts to sort of trace the history of his family. There was an uprising that happened in the town, and his ancestors were involved, and he goes back to this really eerie town to try and retrace like what's happened, what his family's role in it was, and yet the legacy of this uprising. And it is a very unsettling book. Like some really disgusting stuff happens in it. There's a lot of description of like horrible things. Again, this sort of feels autumnal. I think it is really cold when he goes. I think it's maybe winter time. And this town's really freaky as well. So yeah, this is like, it's not a horror book. You're not going to be scared by it, but it's definitely the most horror leaning. And the last one I would recommend for a sort of eerie book is Braised Pork by Anu. This one is definitely not horror, but it's like an odd book where you're like, what's going on? So basically this woman discovers her husband dead in the bath, and with him is a note that has a picture of a fish on it, and she sort of is trying to figure out what's going on. It's set in a big city in China. I can't actually remember which city it's set in. It's either set in Hong Kong or Shanghai, I think. And she sort of starts to do a bit of investigating into like what her husband's been up to and what's happened with this fish note. And she sort of gets sucked into this very weird world. I won't really say any more than that because it is, again, quite an unusual book and it's really stayed with me. I don't really normally like mystery type books, but I thought this one was really compelling. Just the sort of, it has a magical realist sort of feel element to it. And yeah, I think it's really good for autumn. So next on my list was Russian classics, because I think they're very good for autumn winter time. You know, they're very long normally, and Russia's a cold country, so for me, I always associate it with sort of autumn and winter. I have some I would like to recommend. I've read quite a lot of Russian classics. I wouldn't recommend all of them. Like, I have read War and Peace, and I did like War and Peace, but it's definitely not one of my favourites. The same with Crime and Punishment. I think it's actually the perfect autumn book, but I think a lot of people have read it. I really liked it, but I have another Dostoevsky book that I prefer. So yeah, the first one I would recommend is Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. This is like a very short book and it doesn't really have an autumnal feel, so don't go into expecting that, but this is a good Russian classic, I think, if you are new to Russian classics, because it is a bit shorter and it's quite easy to follow what's going on. There aren't too many characters. We're basically following this young man called Bazarov, who is very skeptical of everything. He believes in hard science and he doesn't believe in emotions, essentially. He thinks that everything can be measured. And his friend, who sort of following Bazarov around to a certain extent, we go to his friend's parents' house and we meet his friend's father and uncle, and they're very different. And it's sort of this clash of generations story where Bazarov is being quite unpleasant. He keeps arguing with everyone and his friends getting a bit annoyed by him, and then we go back and we meet Bazarov's family. And yeah, this is a book where like not loads happens, but I think the characters are very realistic. It's one of those books that I think has aged very well, because it is sort of a tale of generational strife, almost like you're arguing with your parents. And I think that exists now. You know, like the younger generation thinks that their parents are old and boring and don't understand how life really is, and the parents think that their children are young and naive and they'll grow into their beliefs. And that, you know, the fact that was happening like 150 years ago in Russia goes to show that like that's always going to continue to happen. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one, and I would recommend. Probably one of the most famous Russian classics, but one that I really did enjoy and would recommend, is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. I really like this edition of this book. I read this like a few years ago now, and I would like to reread it. But this is by far my favourite Tolstoy. As I say, I have read War and Peace and I did like it, but nowhere near as much as Anna Karenina. I think just because I'm not that interested in war. I think that the name of Anna Karenina is sort of misleading actually, because yes, she is one of the protagonists in it, but it's definitely not a book just about her. We follow her and her sort of unhappy marriage with her husband. She meets a man called Count Vronsky and they start an affair. So it's about that on one side. On the other side, we have this landowner called Levin, and he's sort of coming to terms with the changes in Russian society. It's still very much a serf system, and he has some ideas that people think are a bit crazy that he wants to change things up. So yeah, we're following, those are the two sort of main storylines, but there are so many great characters in this book. It is really compelling. It's definitely a good one for autumn winter just to like get sucked into. I think it's worth the hype, this one. And a couple that I've read more recently, I would recommend Dead Souls by Gogol for autumn winter. I read this one last year and really liked it. This is like sort of a farcical book in a way. We meet this man who has been going around trying to buy people's dead serfs because a census is done every sort of 10 years, and in between times, if you're a landowner and you own a serf that dies, you're still sort of paying tax for them. So people are kind of keen to get rid of their dead serfs, and they're very confused at the fact that someone's going to pay them money to like own someone that doesn't exist. So it's a very like weird concept for a story. And yeah, we sort of follow lots of different landowners and their reactions to this request. This book is unfinished, is the one thing I would say. Gogol did not finish it before he died, but I don't really think that matters too much, because by the time I got to the end and I was like, oh wait, this just finishes halfway through a page, you kind of like get the gist of where it's going. I don't really think it matters, but if that is something that bothers you, then I would skip this one. Yes, one that I would really recommend is The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I much preferred this to Crime and Punishment. I think that I just heard so much hype around Crime and Punishment and I hadn't heard much about The Idiot at all, and I was very pleasantly surprised when I read this. So this is a very strange book where I can't remember the main character's name, I'm not gonna lie. I'll put it up on the screen, but we're introduced to this prince and he is prone to sort of what we would now call epilepsy fits, and everyone thinks he's very naive. There are like a few women that are very interested in him. He's quite, he is quite rich, and it really just follows him and like what he decides he's going to do, and it did not go in a direction I was expecting. It's definitely not like a love story, I would say. There are always so many characters in Dostoevsky's books, and some of my favourites are definitely the side characters. There are lots of side plots here where it's like a sort of critique on Russian society, on the poor, and we have people that are dying of sort of consumption, as happens in a lot of his books. But yeah, I just find this one really compelling, and again, it's quite long, so I would recommend for autumn winter. And then the last one that is not a Russian classic really, but it involves Russian classics, is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. This is a book essentially of 8 Russian short stories by very famous authors. So there are a couple by Tolstoy, there's a Turgenev, I think, there are Chekhov stories, and one other person, I can't remember. But anyway, there are 8 short stories from 4 very famous Russian writers, and we get the full short story, and then at the end we get George Saunders an essay about each short story. He has taught them all in English, like he's an English professor at a university in America, so he's taught all of these Russian writers. So yeah, we get the story, and then we get an essay about the story. And I think that for me, like, especially for Russian classic short stories, I think it's quite hard to really get the point of the story reading it 150 years later. So to be able to get both the sort of like critique of their writing and how they're building tension, but also of like what the story means, of the historical context, is really, really useful. So I think if you're like trying to get into Russian classics, this is a really good place to start, especially if you're not big into short stories. I think that this is written in a very accessible way. You get a good selection of stories, and George Saunders' love for sort of Russian literature really shines through. In this, he's like very enthusiastic about the stories, which is always nice. Historical fiction was one of the categories I had because I think this is really good for autumn winter as well. A lot of the historical fiction books that I've read have been quite long and again very immersive. The first is like very famous historical fiction, The Crimson Petal and the White by Michel Faber. This is an excellent book. It's very, very long. My edition is like 850. This is a book set in Victorian London, and we follow a prostitute named Sugar, and she meets a sort of rich man who is a business owner, and she sort of sees an opportunity, and he has like completely fallen head over heels for her. And so we follow him and his wife. Then we follow Sugar. This is definitely a very slow burn book as well. We get a lot of description and it really builds up to the plot points. But yeah, if you want like a very immersive Victorian London story with drama and intrigue and yeah, basically everything you could want from historical fiction, I would really recommend this one. Another huge historical fiction book is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. This won the Booker Prize in like 2013. Again, it's about 800 pages, but this book is really, really good. So this is a book about a man who arrives in New Zealand to sort of try and make his fortune in gold mining. When he gets to the town he's planning to stay in, he meets these 12 men who are trying to sort of solve a crime, and we get very involved in their story, and it sort of takes us back to the beginning of what's happened, and we follow it very, very slowly throughout. The characters in this book are really good. Like, considering there's so many characters, I think they're all really well developed. It's also like, I think you could reread this book so many times because there's so much going on. She really uses astrology throughout this book, so I know nothing about astrology, but like if you know what the astrological signs mean, I think you would get a lot out of this, because I think each character is meant to be sort of assigned certain characteristics because of their astrology. So really interesting from that point of view. But yeah, like if you want a good historical fiction where again lots of drama set in a sort of different setting, because I feel like gold mining in New Zealand, there's not very many stories about that. I would really recommend. It also sort of does track the racism in New Zealand at this time towards Indigenous people. There are some Chinese characters in it that are not treated particularly nicely. I would just really highly recommend this one. I thought it was a very, very good book. Another historical fiction I would recommend is Segu by Maurice Condé. This is an epic historical fiction about Northern Africa. So this is set in the African kingdom of Segu in 1797. And this is sort of a period of history that I didn't really know very much about. We have sort of different tribes in the north of Africa. Some of them have started converting to Islam. There are some Christian tribes, and there are some that follow more traditional African religions. The slave trade is starting, and there's a lot going on here. And yet we follow a few characters as they try and traverse bits of North Africa. This is, I'd say, is just like a solid historical fiction. Like the writing is good, the plot is good, and yeah, like I think it's a solid read. This is probably not going to stick with me as one of my absolute favourite books, just because I don't really love books that have such a straightforward narrative as this, but yeah, I think it's very immersive, and it's a period of history that I knew very little about before going into it, so I think if you want a historical fiction that you can learn a lot, I would highly recommend this one. And then one that I read at the start of this year is The Eighth Life by Nino Harataschivili. This is a Georgian book about a family from basically the Russian Revolution up until the early 2000s. We follow the great-grandmother, grandfather, and then the mother and the daughter, and then the daughter's niece, so sort of told from the daughter's perspective. And yeah, it's basically we follow everything that happened in Georgia throughout this time period, and it's really fascinating because we have the Russian Revolution, and then we have the Second World War, we have communist times, and then we're into sort of post-communist, more modern era. All the characters are really great in this book. It's sort of following a chocolate maker's family. I say that's quite a small part of it, but every time that someone makes this chocolate, it's like a hot chocolate recipe that's been passed down throughout the family, something really bad happens. So every time you see someone drinking hot chocolate, you're like, oh dear, something very bad's going to happen. I would say that there's some really horrific things that happen in this book. It's definitely done in quite a realistic way. Like, I don't think that it feels too much. But yeah, I just like warning for that because it is very sad. But it's probably quite a realistic portrait of a family living throughout 20th century Georgia. So yeah, I'd really recommend this one. At no point was I bored by this book, and this is Again, like 900 pages. So yeah, really recommend. And then yes, there are a few readathons that take place in the autumn that I would like to take part in this year. So I have a few recommendations for books that fit into these categories. And the first is Victober, which takes place in October, where it's just a month of reading Victorian books. They normally have specific prompts. I don't think they've come out yet this year, but I thought I would have more books to recommend for Victorian literature. But when I looked through, I have read some like classic Victorian books, but I feel like they're recommended all the time. So, for example, Wuthering Heights is obviously a great autumn book. So is Jane Eyre. I've not really read much Dickens. I don't particularly love Dickens, but Great Expectations is a good autumn read. But yeah, I thought I'd just pick out a couple of books. So one that I would say is like not my favourite Victorian book by any stretch of the imagination, but is one that I think feels quite melancholic and autumnal, and that's Villette by Charlotte Bronte. I don't particularly like this copy I have of it. Basically, we are following Lucy Snow, who arrives in Belgium. She gets a post in a girls' school, and she feels quite isolated, and that's sort of a theme throughout this book. There are a couple of sort of love interests in it, but it really is just sort of tracking her journey as a person throughout this book, and I think because of the sort of tone of it, it really works well for autumn. At some point she just wants to give Lucy a bit of a shake because she is very shy and she has very little self-confidence, and sometimes it's very clear that people like her and she just always like takes a step back from it. I think it's a very interesting book from that point of view because quite often that's not the sort of heroine we get in Victorian literature. So yeah, I would really recommend this one for autumn if you're wanting a more sort of melancholic read. I've actually just realised that this one is not Victorian, but I'm just going to recommend it anyway because I think it says it was first published in 1818, but never mind. And that's Marriage by Susan Ferrier. I've not really heard many people talking about this book, but if you like Jane Austen, you should be reading Susan Ferrier because she is just as good as Jane Austen. She is Scottish, she lives in Edinburgh. The book is about Lady Juliana, who is sort of a rich English woman, and she marries a Scottish Highlander. And she moves there and she has kids, and then she goes back to London with one of the daughters, and she leaves the other daughter in the Highlands. So she grows up in the Scottish Highlands and then she goes to England to visit her mother. And so it's a very interesting sort of juxtaposition of cultures because we have Lady Juliana, who sort of seems like a sort of spoiled city woman who comes up to the Highlands and she hates everything about it. She thinks it's cold, she thinks people are unpleasant. And then because she leaves with one of her daughters, the daughter starts to have sort of the same opinions as Lady Juliana, but Mary, who's left behind, becomes a sort of rough Highland lady. And when she goes to London, she struggles to fit into society there. So it's definitely like a very interesting social commentary on Scotland versus England and class. And it's also a love story. So yeah, this one is great. Like I think if you like Jane Austen, you should really be trying Susan Ferrier. And then the other readathon that I would like to take part in this year is Nonfiction November. Again, there are normally prompts that come out, but I don't think they've come out yet. So I'd just give you a couple of nonfiction recommendations as well. So the first one is a memoir, and that's Names for the Sea by Sarah Moss. This is a memoir about Sarah Moss's year living in Iceland, and I think this is very good for autumn winter because a lot of it, not all of it, some of it's obviously set in the summer, but a lot of it takes place in this very cold Icelandic winter and her struggling to come to terms with the dark essentially, which is a feeling I have every single year, even though I don't live in Iceland, and I'm sure it's worse in Iceland because I think they get basically no sunlight for the whole of it. She's got a teaching post at a university in Reykjavik, and it's a very detailed sort of glimpse into her life, but also interrogating Icelandic customs, culture, history. It very much goes through a lot of the things that she found odd when she arrived, and she would start to speak to people and figure out why people were doing things this way, and then we get an explanation of it. So I think it's very good if you want to really learn more about a certain culture, and yeah, definitely very autumn wintry. A lot of it is about the cold, dark winter, so I would recommend. And this one has a very snowy cover actually, and that's Eat the Buddha by Barbara Demick. This is a piece of investigative journalism by Barbara Demick, who went to Tibet. It really follows the history of Tibet from sort of the 1950s, where China claimed sovereignty over Tibet, and then we follow their sort of struggle for independence. Obviously Tibet is still part of China, so they've not succeeded, and yeah, we follow how people's lives have changed throughout this time. And at the point when this was written, which I think is like the 2020 was when this came out, there have been some sort of demonstrations where people have been setting themselves on fire as a protest against the Chinese government. Life in Tibet is very restricted, like you cannot leave the territory you're from. So if you want a book to learn more about this sort of area where you don't really hear very much, it's like a sort of look behind what's behind the curtain, see what's going on, and also a book that's going to make you very angry. I would really recommend this one. I think it's really well written. She interviews a whole range of people, and it's sort of almost told a bit of like in a sort of narrative non-fiction style where we're following a few characters throughout their lives. I would really recommend this one. And the last one, which follows on from my sort of Russian classic recommendation, is The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore. He's a really famous non-fiction author. He wrote Jerusalem, he wrote Young Stalin, and it seems like especially Russian history seems to be of particular interest to him. This is a huge book as well. This basically follows the whole of the Romanov family from, let me tell you, it's got the years in the front. Or does it? Oh yeah, it's here. 1613 to 1918. So we have 300 years of Romanov history. I didn't really understand Russian Tsars and the history. And like, you hear about Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. I didn't really know what they've done. So that's why I picked this one up, because I wanted to get a bit more of an insight into it. I don't know if this is the best place to start because this is full of information, but really interesting period of history. Like some of these stars had really interesting lives, and it seems like he's really done his research. Like it didn't seem too over the top. There are a lot of sources cited in this. It gives you a good insight into Russian history, because obviously the Tsars were very much like involved in everything that was going on. We see different periods of unrest throughout the 300 years, and then how it all culminates in 1918. So yeah, if you're looking for like a really chunky history book that is still quite accessible, I would recommend The Romanovs. So yes, those are some books that I would really recommend for autumn and going into winter as well. I would love to hear any recommendations you have for any of these categories, or just any other autumnal books. I've not really made a start on my autumn reading yet, after posting a video with loads of books that I want to read, but I will hopefully get to that in the next couple of weeks, and I'll be back with another video soon.